I am so grateful for Lawrence as a mentor, as our preacher here, as an elder, and as a friend. And for those of you who don't know, he suffered from vertigo about, I guess it was last Friday night. And that can be really rough. And so I'm grateful that Lawrence is back. That was why I preached last Sunday. But I just have been thinking this week in particular about just how grateful I am for his example, and not just he, but Janice as well. Just the two of them, the love that they have for this church family, the work that they do and put in behind the scenes is absolutely amazing. And I'm grateful that I kind of get the behind the scenes look at it, that I get some of the sneak peek at times of just all the things that they do that people don't realize. But that's not just true of Lawrence and Janice, but all of our eldership and their wives. I'm so grateful to be here in a church family with leaders like this who deeply care for the flock and desire in every way to love and provide for their souls. And so I'm very grateful this morning. And in general, I'm grateful because this is a time of year when this church family has a lot going on that is really amazing to witness, whether that's VBS that's in preparation or Camp Forge as kind of an adjunct thing that we do here for all of our teens. The countless things that are going on where people are just so many hands put to the plow. And I pray that in all of these upcoming efforts that the Lord will provide abundant fruit through our efforts. We're continuing this morning in a 10-part series through the Sermon on the Mount that we're calling The Narrow Path. The Narrow Path. And we last week focused on the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes, in summary, can be said as such that the kingdom comes to those who the world thinks are beyond the reach of good news. To the world, it seems like the poor in spirit, the meek, the mourning are beyond the reach of any good news that could come into their lives. And yet Jesus comes and he brings the kingdom to them. However, the kingdom comes not so much to change their external circumstances, but to transform their internal character. And that is the heart of these Beatitudes. That's the heart of this Sermon on the Mount. Jesus speaks into a crowd of the lowly and the poor and the suffering. And he says, I recognize you and I see you, and I am reinstating and reaffirming the value and the dignity that you have in the eyes of God, despite the condition that you're in. And I'm telling you that even though the world thinks that you are beyond the reach of good news, by following the narrow path, you can experience life in the kingdom. And so maybe this morning you feel like you have been at times, or maybe are this very morning beyond the reach of good news. You feel like there are hard circumstances that you're dealing with in life. Or maybe you feel like one of the Beatitudes really resonates with you. The good news is that as we get into the midst of this narrow path this morning, as we follow Jesus in one of the most difficult teachings, the good news is that if we follow him, then the kingdom belongs to us. He comes to change our internal character. And that means no matter our situation, we can be salt and we can be light on this narrow path. And so that leads us to verse 20, where Jesus makes this statement. He says, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus says the kingdom belongs to you, but if your righteousness never goes beyond the scribes and Pharisees, then you will not enter, you will not experience this amazing kingdom life. Now, this word righteousness is one of those church words that can kind of get lost on us. It's like, what does righteousness really mean? Well, one of the best ways to think about righteousness is to simply say it's about being in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. And what the law and the prophets, what all the Old Testament was pointing to, was a world where justice and righteousness was done, a world of right relationship, where there was harmony between every human being and harmony between all humanity with God and with creation. This is what was promised. And Jesus says true righteousness has to go beyond the scribes and Pharisees. And so what was wrong with their righteousness? Well, as it's familiar with probably most of us, the righteousness of the Pharisees, or the way that they thought about righteousness, was primarily about external religion. It was primarily about the rules that they kept that were purely on the outside without necessarily affecting their internal character. And that's why Jesus calls them whitewashed tombs. They look clean and nice and great on the outside. They project an appearance. They virtue signal in all these various ways, and yet their hearts are far from knowing the Lord. But the narrow path, this way of righteousness, the way to true right relationships, runs down to the very heart of every person. And this leads Jesus to launch into 6 super practical teachings on how to follow this way of righteousness. And each of them follow a pattern where Jesus says, you've heard it said, and he'll quote something from the Old Testament, and then he'll say, I say to you this. And initially, it might seem like Jesus is coming along and contradicting what was said before, but that's not really the case. It's better to think of it in terms of Jesus is reinstating, reaffirming what God has always said, but then drawing out the depth of meaning behind it, the meaning that the people were always supposed to see and comprehend and understand. Jesus takes the good laws of the Lord and brings it down to the heart level. He comes not to abolish the law, but he says to fulfill it. And so we come to the first one in verse 21, where Jesus says, you have heard it said to the ancients, that it was said to the ancients, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. Now, hopefully so far we're all on the same page. Murder is bad. And I think Jesus' audience at that time would have agreed. But the question that Jesus is raising is, if I go my entire life without murdering anyone, does that mean that I've really fulfilled the righteousness of God? Does that really mean that I've been in right relationship with God and with my neighbor? And Jesus would say, it's got to go deeper than that. So you've heard it said, do not murder. Verse 22, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever says you good for nothing will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now notice Jesus does something really interesting here that seems counterintuitive. First, he starts on one hand with this list of anger and saying you good for nothing, and then kind of a name calling, an insult, saying you fool. And what we would see in that is kind of a digression in severity. The anger that's talked about here is that sort of vehement rage that we feel toward another person, or this resentment that builds up, this hatred and malice that we store up in our hearts that's waiting to strike, and is the very reason and cause most of the time for murder. But then beneath that is something that we would consider less severe. you good for nothing. That's an insult. It's certainly offensive and can be very degrading, but it's less severe than this resentment and bitterness that we keep in our hearts. And then the last thing would seem to be the least severe in the sense that it's calling someone a name. You fool, you idiot, you moron. And yet, as these decrease, notice the severity of the consequences increases. That to be angry, he says, you'll be liable to judgment, the discernment of the elders in your community. And to say you good for nothing, you'll be liable to the council or the Sanhedrin. This would be kind of like the Supreme Court. So now the consequences are up. But then at the last, when it's simply this seemingly insignificant name calling, the consequences are the judgment of hell, the divine courtroom. And I like the way that one scholar put it. It's as if Jesus is trying to scramble our notions, to scramble our ideas about how we evaluate righteousness. That by our standards, we think by simply not murdering people, we're doing a pretty good job. But Jesus ups the intensity on what we consider to be the least severe kind of treatment towards someone. And so here Jesus is taking things down to the heart. But we might ask the question, well, what does anger, contempt, and name-calling have to do with murder? We see what Jesus is doing here, drawing out this connection. But how do these things relate to each other? Well, one way to think about murder is that it's not merely the unjust taking of a life, but it is a public declaration that says this person's life has no value to me. Whether people are aware, whether that is the motivation that they think of for committing the murder, what's going on in reality is a public declaration that says this person's life does not matter to me. And the point is to see that we can do this in many other ways than murdering people. There are many other ways that we can devalue people's lives. And so that's why Jesus connects these with murder. They all emerge from the same spirit of contempt where I devalue the life and worth of other people. And whether I simply belittle a person or I murder them in cold blood, I'm sending the same message that their life is ultimately worthless to me. And so it's not just about literally taking someone's life. This command, you shall not murder, is really about the thousands of ways that our actions and our words take the life out of other people. When we cut them down through insult and belittling and making them feel small and humiliating them and being hypercritical and so on and so forth, these are all the various ways that we take life from other people and prove to God, to them, and to other people watching that we don't really think they're that worth it. And I think we've all seen this. Have you ever been in a home or a friend group or maybe a workplace that feels lifeless? A good reason for that, a very likely explanation for the reason why it feels lifeless in this environment is because of this spirit of contempt. Maybe a parent gets angry and is used to saying, "Are you good for anything around here?" Or perhaps a coworker takes a joke a little bit too far and you laugh and so does everybody else, but deep down you feel small and humiliated. Or maybe you trusted a friend with some private information, something personal, and words somehow got out and it feels like a small part of your dignity, your sense of self is taken away. These are all the ways that we take life from other people. And at first, these may seem small and insignificant, but do you remember what James says? James 3 and verse 6, he's talking about the tongue. And he says this tongue, while it can be used for good, sure, it can also be like a deadly poison. And he says it can become like a spark that sets a whole forest ablaze. And do you remember how he says it's set on fire? He says it's set ablaze by the fire of hell. And isn't that so true? Haven't we seen the ways that whether it's our words or our subtle actions, these small ways that our belittling of other people can create a world of hell around us? And so even though it may not manifest in murder, contempt always has the same destructive effect in the world. It takes life out of the people that we're supposed to love the most, and rather than creating a world of righteousness, it can turn this world into a living hell of broken relationships. This kind of spirit of contempt where I don't value and properly esteem the people around me manifests itself in a world of unrighteousness. And so, verse 23, Jesus says this. Says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you. And perhaps specifically what Jesus has in mind is if you recognize that you've had anger and resentment built up in your heart, or you've expressed that through calling your brother good for nothing, or perhaps you've just simply called them a name or belittled them in some way. Jesus says, if you're there and you remember this, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Have you ever tried to worship God while feeling contempt or anger towards somebody else? It doesn't really work out so well. You're singing about the love of God. Jesus loves me, this I know, or oh, how I love Jesus, but I don't really love this person few rows down. They have really rubbed me the wrong way, or maybe it's closer to home. Oh, how I love Jesus, but on the way to church this morning, my spouse made me really upset, or my kid drove me crazy, and you feel that sensation in your heart of anger and frustration, contempt. It doesn't work out so well. Or maybe you've experienced this from a different perspective. Maybe has anyone ever come up to you and tried to act like everything was okay, like you were on good terms, like you were really good friends, when you know that they have wronged someone you love? I mean, how difficult is that to maintain a good relationship with someone who you know has just wronged this other person? Here they are acting like everything is okay. And so why would we expect anything different from God? How can we go on acting as if we're on good terms with the Lord when we're not on good terms with one another? And this, of course, is the point that John makes in 1 John 4 when he says, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. But whoever loves God must also love his brother. Now, I find it interesting that with this example of someone going to offer a gift, to offer a sacrifice, I find it interesting that this example echoes back to the very first murder in the Bible. Cain and Abel both offer a gift before the Lord. And Abel's sacrifice is accepted, but Cain's, for reasons that we're not told, is rejected. And so Cain becomes very angry, and he becomes so angry that the Lord comes to him and he says, sin is crouching at your door, its desires for you, but you must rule over it. And in other words, God is saying, I sense the anger and the bitterness that's building up in your heart, and you have a moment right here whether or not you're going to let the spirit of contempt and resentment in. And instead, Cain allows it to build to the extent that he strikes his brother down. And in that moment, he declares that his own brother's life is of no value to him. That Abel's life is worthless. In fact, that's the response that he gives to God in that moment. Where's your brother? Cain's response, I'm not my brother's keeper. His life doesn't matter to me. And in this moment, it makes me wonder that as he declares his own brother's life worthless, perhaps that's the reason that Cain's sacrifice is rejected all along. The problem was not the offering itself, but the heart of the offerer. Cain is here evaluating himself, comparing himself to his brother Abel. And perhaps what was really wrong with the sacrifice wasn't that he did anything wrong to the sacrifice itself, but it was that his heart was full of comparison and contempt and rivalry toward Cain or toward Abel. He needed to first be reconciled to his brother. And so in a similar way, Jesus says to us, go and make it right. Go and make it right. Now, we'll talk more about what that looks like in a moment, but notice the first step Jesus says here is to remember. If you remember something that your brother may have against you, go and make it right. And I think the problem here is that we are perhaps very quick to remember the wrongs of others, but not so quick to remember our own. In fact, we usually justify our contempt and bitterness toward others by recalling to mind everything that they've done wrong to us. Roommate is late, makes me late for work, and so I'll give them the silent treatment. That person was mean to me at work, so I'm going to gossip and talk about them behind their back. Maybe a spouse says, my husband put us in a bad financial situation and has just not led the family well, so I'm going to harbor this contempt in my heart. And in the moment, it might feel good and justified and maybe even helpful because it feels like a way that you're getting back, like you're making up for the loss that was done to you. But notice what Jesus says in verse 25. He says, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. And truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. That's pretty harsh. But the point is not to say, hey, if you are in a literal lawsuit, try to work things out, strike a deal before you get to the courtroom. That's not really Jesus' point in this instance. He's using this as an analogy. And back in verse 22, the court that Jesus refers to is the divine courtroom. And he's saying that while in an earthly courtroom, they only care about whether or not you have murdered your brother, in the divine courtroom, what God really cares about is your heart. And as long as you harbor anger and contempt and malice toward other people, you are never going to be free. That's what this is about. As long as I am harboring this anger toward other people in my heart, as long as I hold this spirit of contempt where I elevate myself above other people and determine their worth and value based upon what they have done to me or the mistakes that they have made, I will always feel like I am in this debtor's prison, constantly paying this debt. And the only way to get out of that is to release myself, or maybe I should say release the other person from the contempt that I hold over them. I love the way that It's put in the big book, what's known as the big book from Alcoholics Anonymous, where in this book they describe how the real heart of the issue is rarely ever alcohol. It is very rarely ever addiction. The heart of the issue is typically this resentment and anger that they hold toward the world and toward specific people in their lives. And in what's known as the big book, it says to conclude that others were wrong is as far as most of us ever got. And isn't that true? That's about as far as anybody gets, that we conclude everybody else is wrong. And the usual outcome of this, they say, is that people continue to wrong us and we stayed sore. And that's the result every time. To only go as far as to recognize the wrongs of others is to continue to live in a world where people wrong us and we just stay sore and bitter and hurt all the time. But he says, a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. And if we are to live, then we had to be free of anger. This was the shift, the paradigm shift, the transforming thing that changed many, many people's lives who were stuck in the rut of resentment. It's to let go. And so it feels good to ruminate, but the only way to be free is to come to terms with our accuser, to lay our gift at the altar and to go and be reconciled with our brother. And so what does that really look like? What does it look like to give up our resentments and go be reconciled? Does that mean that we should literally stop worship? We're in the middle of a song and someone just up and leaves and you know they're on the way to make things right with their brother. That might not be a bad internal posture to take. But I think there are three ways that we can be on the road to reconciliation. And the first is to reflect. In verse 23, reconciliation starts with remembering. We can't go and make things right with our brother until we remember the ways that we've wronged them. And what that requires is self-reflection. Now, everyone practices some kind of self-reflection, but typically the way that we self-reflect is on all of our personal embarrassments or the ways that we've wronged other people. Maybe our head hits the pillow at night and the highlight reel runs of all the ways that we maybe embarrassed ourselves throughout the day or the ways that people wronged us here and there. But true self-reflection is a posture of introspection. It is setting aside time to invite God, in the words of David in Psalm 139, to search and know our hearts, to see if there's any grievous way within us. It's asking, how have I felt toward others throughout the day? When I really think about it, what has my heart been like? When I woke up in the morning, what was my disposition toward my roommates? What was my disposition toward my parents or my spouse? When I got on the bus to go to school, what was my disposition toward my friends? When I got to the workplace, how was I feeling about toward the people around me? How did I feel toward my boss? So on and so forth. It's examining, how did I feel toward the people around me today? And then number two, how did that manifest in my actions toward them? Maybe I didn't recognize it at the time, but I woke up and I was a little bit on the wrong side of the bed and so rubbed me the wrong way. And so I realized that the way that seeped out, the way that my feelings of frustration manifest itself in this relationship was I was extremely dismissive. Or maybe the way that it manifests itself was I was irritated and I lashed out with these angry words. And I didn't even catch it at the time, but now in this moment of self-reflection, I can go back and I can recognize the ways that this feeling in my heart seeped out in my actions toward the people that I'm supposed to love. But the second part is to rehearse it. That after we have spent time in self-reflection before God, we go and rehearse what we've brought before God to other people. And this, as you can imagine, is the hardest part. Because at this stage, we are really tempted to either hold back and not fully express the feelings and the internal workings of our heart in the ways that we wronged them, or we're maybe tempted to make excuses along with how we state our wrongdoing, or we're happy to include all their wrongs with it. And instead, what rehearsing this before others ought to look like is to acknowledge our internal feelings and state how our feelings have impacted them. It's a very simple process, but it changes a lot. That as I approach someone, the primary thought that should be going through my mind as far as how to make this right is to first start by stating, this is how I was feeling. This is what I was experiencing, and this experience that I was working through internally seeped out in the ways that I acted at whatever point in the day it might have been. And that can be so difficult, but it is so transforming. And it leads to the final thing, and that is to reevaluate. And this last step is so important. If the command, do not murder, is ultimately about all the ways that we take life from other people by not valuing them and affirming their worth, then the final step toward reconciliation is to reevaluate them according to their true worth in the eyes of God. To recognizing that the ultimate reason that I have mistreated them is that I have not valued them enough. And beyond merely apologizing, I'm now committed to seeing and valuing them in the way that they deserve as a child of God. And so here is the road to reconciliation. This is the ways that we create a world of righteousness, a world of right relationships. And perhaps we're starting to see why this is called the narrow path, because this can be really difficult. But I want to remind us of the things that Philip brought to our attention right at the start of this series. That as we journey this narrow path, Jesus goes before us and beside us. And so I want to think about what that means in this specific command. Notice the realization happens when you are at the altar. And isn't that interesting? And maybe you've experienced this. I find it to be the case that the moments where I become most aware of the ways that I've hurt other people are often the times that I'm drawing near to God. That drawing near to God has a way of drawing my attention to the way that I've hurt the people around me. And I think that's especially true here in Jesus. But notice the gift that Jesus offers is the gift of his own life, slain on the altar of the cross. And the cross was not just an instrument of death. It was designed to mock and humiliate and shame. The cross was the ultimate way of declaring someone's life worthless. And the point is to say this, that Jesus suffered the worthlessness of the cross to prove just how worth it we are to God. And in this way, Jesus ultimately fulfills the command, do not murder. Jesus takes it beyond just not taking someone's life. He even takes it beyond just avoiding the small ways that I take life from other people. What Jesus does in the way that he fulfills this law is to say, how can I prove and affirm in every way the worth and dignity and value of humanity in the eyes of God? And he goes so far as to experience the utter worthlessness of the cross to demonstrate just how worth it we are to God. And if that's true, if I'm valued this much, then how can I not value other people in the same way? Or maybe an even more insightful question is, if God values all of us this much, so much that he would assume the worthless death on a cross, then what length will I go to prove the worth of the people around me? See, for Jesus, it goes so far beyond just the text on a page, the command, do not murder. For Jesus, it goes all the way down to the heart. And it's getting rid of a heart that devalues other people and instead asks, with every aspect of my life, all of my resources, everything I have, everything I do, how can I present that as an offering that declares the worth and dignity and importance of other people? Maybe this morning you realize that has not been the ways that you have tried to live your life, and that you are ready to depart from a road that has led to broken relationships and instead come and follow Jesus on this narrow path. Maybe we all need to pray deeply over this. But if you need to come forward and unite your life with his and experience the power of him walking before you and beside you, we would love to help you in that. However we can help you this morning, come forward now as we stand and as we sing.